All right. Well, thank you for taking the time to join our last webinar session of our series for our 2020 series, Ensuring a Strong M365. We're going to be up this series with talking about security at the data level. So we've, let me actually just jump into the presentation here, if my screen will respond. There we go. So in the previous sessions, we've talked a lot about other security capabilities, specifically around the identity, devices, the apps. So we're kind of wrapping everything up now with talking about how do we protect the data. We're not saying that those other uh, three areas aren't critically important to a strong security posture in the cloud. All of these capabilities kind of work hand in hand, but once we get past all the identity and the devices and even the apps that we can control, kind of our last line of defense is controlling access to data, whether we maintain the physical possession of that data or if it should happen to leave our possession, such as putting it on a flash drive and that flash drive walks out the door. So we're going to talk a lot about what information protection or data protection really is. And I'm going to be more heavy on the demonstration here. So I'm going to try to get through my slides real quick here. But to kind of give everyone a background on what we mean by information or data protection, it's a process of identifying what data that you have and implementing the necessary controls to restrict access to that data, regardless of who has possession of it. So if you look at the data that you typically have in your organization, you could probably compare it to this bar on the left-hand side, to where the vast majority of the data you have is probably very low, publicly disclosed. If someone outside of the organization gets access to it, it's probably not going to cause you a lot of harm. But maybe it depends on your industry as well. If you're in the government sector, you probably everything should be more confidential. But this is just a generalization that most of our data is low risk. But as we start to look at what data we have that might contain trade secrets, sensitive information such as HIPAA information or personally identifiable information, we need to start thinking of that as our confidential data, information that really shouldn't be shared or publicly disclosed, even accidentally outside of the organization. If we really wanted to get granular, we could even have a categorization for secret or top secret data that even within the organization, not everyone should have access to. So if we look at what information protection is, it's really identifying what data we have. There's a process called labeling, and it's really like tag to identify what the permissions and the restrictions are, and that leads into protection. When we talk about protection, we really mean encryption. When we protect a document, we're applying a level of encryption that you have to authenticate to. And then what a lot of organizations that do have information protection strategies in place, they don't necessarily round out this cycle here, but monitoring and responding to data incidents. When someone is accessing a document that they shouldn't, monitoring where your data is going. We get to this position to where, hey, we can say we've protected all of our data, but we get this false impression that that's enough. We don't have to monitor where it's going. We don't have to incident response, because if the data is protected, what could possibly go wrong? And that's not necessarily the case. So when we protect the data, hopefully this animation helps illustrate kind of how this process works. When we protect the data, we are encrypting it. When a user goes to access that data, they have to authenticate themselves. They have to reach out to Azure and provide their identity and validate who they are. Now, that might mean requiring them to provide multi-factor authentication. It might mean they have to come from a trusted device. That's where all of our other session content comes into play, because there's a lot more that goes into that security than just giving a username and a password to authenticate to validate you are who you are. But once you are validated, you get what's called a use license to access that file. It's almost like an authentication token that you receive that lets you unencrypt that file. And that might be temporary. That might have a time frame on it so that it expires after so many days, or maybe it's a one-time use license so that every time you open up that document, you have to authenticate to Azure to make sure that you're allowed access. And if you can't authenticate, or that license has been revoked, you can't access that data. So that's a very high level view of how this process works. If you're familiar with the data protection concept, it used to be called information rights management, and then it became rights management, Azure rights management, and now AIP, or Azure information protection. But you've probably heard some other names called unified labeling, or even Microsoft information protection, or MIP. It can be very confusing when we start talking about the different names, because Microsoft loves to throw out different names and change acronyms all the time. And it really becomes confusing on what's what. So to try to make this a little bit more clear, if we look at Azure information protection, this is kind of the original Azure rights management in the cloud. There was something called Azure labels, or AIP labels, Azure Information Protection labels. Now, AIP has not gone anywhere. It's still here. It's still around. What we're going to hear more about is unified labeling. And to understand where unified labeling comes into play, if you think about the services that are in Office 365, specifically like Exchange and SharePoint, they had their own information rights management components built within the service. And yeah, Exchange Online could reach out to Azure Information Protection and pull back some AIP labels and try to use those. But ultimately, AIP was a label store, a protection configuration store that was just used by AIP. Unified labeling is Microsoft's approach to try to say, hey, let's not containerize our ability to use labels or our protections just in AIP. Let's make this work seamlessly across all the different services, all the different capabilities. And I don't have everything up on this screen, but Exchange and SharePoint can natively use unified labeling. They're not reaching out to AIP to try to pull labels. They're talking directly with the unified labels, and that unified labeling is used across all the other Microsoft security products, such as Cloud App Security, and even leveraged by the data loss prevention, or the DLP scanning engine. It's one store for everyone to reference. Now, when we get into the details, and I'll show you this in the portal, there is a different configuration portal for AIP, and there's a different configuration portal for unified labeling. So hopefully I can make that a little more clear for everyone as we get into the demo. But when we look at data, how do you adopt, how do you get there? There's pretty much 4 stages that we have to reach. First is you have to know what kind of data you have. So if you're going to try to develop a data protection strategy, it's very hard to do that if you don't know what's in your data. Where is it? Where does it go? Who's it being shared with? How are your employees using it? Discovery is the first part to establishing a data protection strategy, because it is, you could just throw protections out there, but you don't know if they're going to do what you need them to do unless you know what you have. Second stage is protecting the data, and this is applying some of our protection labels that apply data encryption on the back end, but it's controlling who has access, where they have access from. Again, the concept here from a data protection perspective is, if I could copy protected data to a USB flash drive, throw it out the window into a parking lot, it doesn't matter who picks up that flash drive. If I haven't given them explicit permission to access the files on that flash drive, they can try to open them up as much as they want, but they're always going to get prompted for credentials. And if they can't authenticate, they can't open that document. Controlling data is taking this a step further. It's not just protecting what you have, but it's starting to use other capabilities such as data loss prevention. Even though the data is protected, we still want to control where it goes, how it's shared, who it's being shared with. And then finally, governing your data. What's your retention? What's your records management strategy? How long are you going to keep certain files for? So this is our big picture of what a data protection strategy looks like on how to get there. And what I want to go through in our demo is really walking through some of the concepts and some of the activities you would have to do to at least get to the discover phase and the protection phase. Controlling and governing data, that's kind of where a lot of companies fall a little bit short, but we want to be able to walk before we can run, right? So if there are any questions, feel free to interrupt me, to just kind of speak up. So don't feel that you can't come off mute. But anyways, I'm going to jump into the demo here. The first thing that we need to do, as I said, is discover the data. So how do we do that? Well, there's a couple of different ways. If you're using cloud data only, if you don't have any on-premise servers or on-premise network file shares or anything like that, all your data lives in the cloud, it's a relatively easy process. You want to first do what's called an auto labeling policy. Actually, before I jump into that, let me first touch real quick upon Azure Information Protection. So if you wanted to configure AIP, it's in the Azure portal, portal.azure.com, and there's a solution here for Azure Information Protection, and hopefully this will load. So in here, we have our configuration for labels. You'll see something similar here. These are defaults: confidential, all employees; highly confidential, all employees. These are default labels. These are some at the top here. There are actually some custom ones that I've created here: public, internal, and confidential. They kind of overlap with what the defaults are named, but I'll get to that when I get to the unified labeling. But you can see that Microsoft actually just kind of put this up here relatively recently, is that they're already indicating that, hey, AIP labels are going to go away. So they're not, AIP is not going to go away itself as a service, but we want to start using unified labeling. And again, that's because all the services, all the features in Microsoft 365 can leverage the unified, whereas they can't leverage the AIP label store out of the box. You have to make them talk to AIP. So we can configure labels here, but we don't really want to, because it is going to go away. When you created a label, they didn't do anything until you published the label. And I'll dive into what the labels are here in a second, so this makes a little bit more sense. But we had to publish the labels with a policy, and this is really assigning labels to go to specific users. So if a user wasn't assigned a policy, they didn't get any labels, they couldn't do any data protection. So this section in AIP is going to go away here in April of next year, but there's going to be components here that are still very important. You'll see here there's some analytics blades. I'll get to that, but a big piece of it is the scanner, and I'll also get to that in a second. But anyways, going back to identifying what data we have, the easiest way to do that if you are cloud only is to look at a auto labeling policy. So if I go into the protection.office.com portal, it's the Security and Compliance Center. To make things confusing, there's also the compliance.microsoft.com and the security.microsoft.com portals. You can technically configure this in all three of them. Now, it's the same unified label store underneath the hood, but for some reason, Microsoft likes to keep this complicated and give you three different portals. Eventually, they are going to move over to the security and the compliance portals themselves. But for right now, I'm actually going to go through the protection.office.com, with the security and compliance center, because this kind of provides the most, I guess, static experience, because Microsoft is constantly making changes to the other two portals. What you see in the protection.office portal has been relatively static So things shouldn't change on you too much until they retire it over to those two new portals. But anyways, if I look at my sensitivity labels, protection label slash sensitivity label, the terminology is used somewhat synonymously, but sensitivity label is what we use for unified labeling. Protection label is what we use for AIP. But ultimately, we kind of use them synonymously. But there's a capability here for auto labeling. And when you create an auto labeling policy, and this is actually now redirecting us to the compliance. So that's a recent change that they've made. So the auto labeling policy pretty much says, hey, where am I going to look and what am I looking for? So if I look at an auto labeling policy, I'm looking for US passport numbers, bank account numbers, driver's license numbers, social security numbers, pretty much the common sensitive information types. Now, a lot of these are just baked in by Microsoft. If I go in here and edit my policy, and I can define what my locations are here. So I could say inspect Exchange as well to see what's in everyone's mailboxes. But right now I'm just applying it to SharePoint to inspect what's in SharePoint. I could also apply it to OneDrive, but I have to choose which accounts to apply them to. And you would think it would be easy here to say, hey, just let me select a user. If I wanted to pick, my administrative account, I can't just type in the user. I actually have to provide it the URL to the user's OneDrive account, which is not the easiest thing to go find, but it's not terribly hard either. But right now, I just have this assigned to one site, and that's in SharePoint. I do have it assigned a rule here. So let me edit the rule. And this is where I can select all of my sensitive information types. If I wanted to add, I could easily do that by adding more sensitive information types. Here's all of the types that Microsoft manages directly. So the nice thing is as these sensitive information types evolve over time, you don't have to do anything. You can just select what they've already got predefined. Microsoft will update their algorithms and their patterns to make sure that they're catching all the relative variations of sensitive information. You could also define some custom ones. That's a little bit beyond the scope of what I'm going to get into, but we could define some custom patterns too if we wanted to. But I'm defining the common sensitive information types here because this pretty much makes up most of the information that we want to protect anyways. So when I say next here, I do have an option to apply a label. And then I have the option to run this in a simulation mode. So what this says is really go inspect, go scan all of my data in those locations that I defined and tell me if you find anything. If I run the simulation, I'm going to cancel all here because I've already run the simulation. You can see here I've already run my simulation. It's been running for about 5 days here. And I found 4 files that match my criteria here. So if I open this up, it'll show me what those files are. And this isn't the prettiest portal pane to navigate or to leverage when you're trying to inspect all of your data. But if I look here at customer data, I open this up. You actually have to have a specific permission that global admins don't have to see this pane here. It's called the Content Explorer. But this will give me a preview of what's in that file. So this is a customer data spreadsheet. And then here you can see there's a bunch of credit card numbers in this file. In here, if I look at the metadata, I can see some more details on what that file is. So where exactly is that file located? Just giving me the file name here doesn't provide me a whole lot of help if I've got hundreds of SharePoint sites that I'm trying to scan here. I can look at that at the metadata of the file, and it's going to tell me all the information that I need to know. So you can see here, here's my rule that it says detect sensitive information for SharePoint. Where is it? It's in the, here we go. So here's the site, and then there should be a full file path. I'm overlooking it somewhere in here. Oh, there. maybe not the easiest to see, but the file path URL, that's the full path to this file in my SharePoint environment. So if I wanted to go find out where that's located, I could easily do that here. But this is the first step to identifying what we have in the environment. So this simulation is just doing an inspection. It's not doing any kind of protections. I could turn the policy on, which would then apply my protection label. But right now I'm just trying to discover what I have. This is great for a cloud, but not so great for on-prem because this doesn't see anything on my on-premise file server. So if I have file servers, if I have an on-premise SharePoint environment, I want to know what's there as well. So the way that we can do that is we use what's called the AIP scanner. And Microsoft has made this a little bit interesting in that the scanner is actually the AIP, the piece that's on here. But the scanner is an on-premise tool. I have a server set up here in my environment. There's really nothing to show because there's no interface for it. If I come in here, my scanner is deployed, which pretty much says I've installed the AIP client, and then I ran a PowerShell command that says install AIP scanner. The only visibility I have into that scanner is that I've got some PowerShell commandlets to apply to AIP. So if I wanted to look at my scanner config, I can do that. It's not going to show me a whole lot because there's not much to there's not much to the config here. It really is, I hate to put it this way, a set and forget. So you install it and the configuration is all in Azure. So let me jump back over to Azure because that's where we have the relevant information. So in the AIP portal, because this is an AIP component, we have this option in here for the scanner. So we can define clusters, we can define nodes. Pretty much a cluster is a collection of scanner nodes. And you might wonder, well, why would I need more than one scanner node? Well, it all depends on the volume of data that you're trying to scan. Some organizations might have petabytes of data. Installing one scanner node to do all the work is probably going to take a very long time to scan all of that data. So you're going to want to have multiple instances, multiple nodes to scan your data. So we define what's called a cluster in AIP, but really this is just a collection of nodes. Once we have the cluster defined, you would think we come in here and we say, hey, add a node. Well, that's not really how it works. We have no button here to say, hey, add node. It's because we've installed the on-prem. That's just the AIP client, but the configuration is going to be pulled from Azure, and this is part where it's not so clear. The configuration is actually the content scan job. A content scan job is pretty much saying, where do you want to look and what are you trying to find? So I've created one scan job here. If I open it up, we'll see a lot of settings in here, but it's pretty much going to say, hey, do I want to schedule this job? Do I want to make it continuous? So after it finishes scanning, just run it again. Always keep it running in the background. But how do I want to apply my configuration to the scanner? Well, you'll see a lot of options here that say policy only or policy default. This is actually being configured by our AIP labeling policy. So probably what I should have jumped into a little bit earlier is the labels in the policy. But so let me do that real quick right now. It's probably would have been better if I did this earlier. So as you saw in the previous pane in AIP, I did have these three labels configured, but what is a label? So I'm going to jump into my confidential label here. Come on. A label is pretty much a tag. It's a tag that we can assign to a document. It doesn't necessarily have to do anything from a protection standpoint, but it's a way for us to identify that document. So I've named this as confidential. My scope here for this label is going to be files and emails. Now you might wonder, well, why would I want to apply this to all of my emails? And that's a good question. You probably don't. Unfortunately, the portal here to set up an AIP or a unified label or a sensitivity label doesn't give us the option to just specify files. It's files and email. So there's a way to get around that. But the scope of this label, what will we apply? Pretty much files and email. Apply, which is really SharePoint and groups, Microsoft 365 groups. And underneath a Microsoft team is actually an Office 365 group. So that technically applies to Teams as well. So you could apply this at a container level if you wanted to, but I have files and email common. I could encrypt the file. I could apply protection here. If I check this box, it'll give me some options in a later window here to say, hey, who's going to have permission? What do we want to do? We could also mark the content, and what this means is I can add a footer or a header or a watermark to the document itself to identify, hey, it's been protected. I'll check those here so that we can see what those configurations look like. But because I checked that protection option, I now have this pane to say, hey, what do I want to do with encryption? I could remove protection if I wanted to, but most likely you're going to apply some kind of encryption. So what permissions do we want to give to this label? We want to assign the permissions now. You do have this option to say, hey, let the user assign permissions. So when they go to choose this label, they could type in recipient email addresses that are going to be assigned permission to the document. That might be a necessary business use case that you have to accommodate, but most likely you're going to say, hey, assign the permissions now because we want to administratively define who has access. User has access to content expires. Now this goes back to that animation on my previous slide where you get a use license. If we say never expires, whoever opens up the protected document simply has to authenticate once. And that license they get is user and device specific, but they never have to authenticate. It's a persistent, like a persistent cookie. It won't go away. And as long as they have it, they'll be able to open up that document. I can say, you know what, after so many days, require that user to authenticate to the document again to validate that they still have access. Or I can say on a specific date, access expires whenever we want. You know, on Wednesday, December 9th, which is tomorrow, it doesn't matter if you have a use license, content expires. Everyone's license is invalidated at this point. No one can access the document except the document owner. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm getting these mixed up. So the access expiration, I'm sorry. So when we say here access content expires is when we just want to revoke everyone's use license. The offline access is going to how many times we have to authenticate. Sorry, I kind of got ahead of myself there. Pretty much saying that every time I go to open up that document, I have to authenticate and validate who I am to Azure. So that's going to require that I have an online connection every time I open up that document. Otherwise, I won't be able to authenticate. Therefore, I won't be able to open up the document. I can still say, hey, a number of days after I open the document, I can kind of have that use license for 7 days. So for a week, I don't have to re-authenticate. That might be valid for use cases where people travel a lot and they have to open up a document, you know, while they're sitting on an airplane or in an airport somewhere without Wi-Fi access. Giving them a short period like 1 day or 2 days might be sufficient because that gives them enough offline access, but still requires them to authenticate frequently enough to where you can ensure that the integrity and the security of that data. You also have the never option, which means, again, authenticate once, and as long as you don't change machines, you essentially have that persistent cookie, so to speak, to always access the document. But what do we want to allow a user after they authenticate? What do we want to allow them to be able to do? So right now, I'll just select all users in my organization, but we can do specific users and groups. We can say specific email addresses or domains, so it doesn't have to be just internal. But we have permission capabilities with this label as well. They do predefine these to try to make it easy. So if it's a co-owner, you pretty much have all access. If you're an author, you can see here that some of the edit rights have disappeared. We could create custom rights here so we can individually select what boxes that we want to give permissions for. So if I want someone to be able to open the document, I can give them the ability to open it. I can give them the ability to print. Let's see, I don't want to give them edit, but I can say, you know what, you can pretty much just take some stuff out of the document, but you can't edit the document. I'm not sure where that use case would be valid, but you can see the permissions that are available here. This is on top of any kind of file permissions that you would apply even at like the NTFS level. So, you know, even if a user has read-only or has, let's say, full access at the file level, at the file server, I can even restrict this further by saying, hey, you know what, our protection, data protection rights are more restricted. So you may have full access NTFS, but you maybe only have view only for data protection. After you define what those permissions are, just add somebody in here. I thought I did. Let me save that. All right. We have that option for content marking. I can add a watermark, header, footer, and I can customize that text. I'm just going to leave that off right now. Auto labeling is dynamic content detection. So if the document contains one of these sensitive information types, the user won't have an option to select what label they want to apply. This is going to apply automatically. They don't have a choice. The document has a social security number. We're going to apply this label because that is sensitive information and it has to have protection. So this kind of is that automated protection for sensitive information. You wouldn't just apply a default label in most situations, but unless that data contains something of a sensitive nature. The protection settings for groups and sites, we didn't select that box, but this is where we would also apply some privacy settings for like SharePoint sites and whatnot, but we're not doing that with this label. Same thing with the Azure preview. But so if I save this label, it's now a protection label that applies encryption and it has permissions assigned to it. I'm going to cancel out of that for right now. So we have labels, but what good are the labels? You know, they're just configurations. How do users consume these? Well, we have to publish them. When we create a label policy, we're pretty much saying, hey, give these labels to this group of users. So you can see here in this policy, I've pretty much said, hey, I'm going to give my confidential, public, and internal labels, and I'm assigning it to my 3 users here, Harry Potter, Neville Longbottom, and then I have this scanner account. So I'll get back to that because I know I kind of jumped away from it. But that's our on-premise scanner account. It has to be licensed to be able to apply protections. So by having this policy in place, if I log into my desktop as one of my users and I open up Word, for example, on this client, you can see here it did a load and add-in. I have the AIP client installed on this machine, but Office has native data protection capabilities baked into it. You'll see this sensitivity bar. As long as you have a policy assigned to you, it won't be grayed out. If you have the client installed, this is what it looks like. If you don't have the client installed, this is pretty much what it looks like, except you don't have this option for show bar and help and feedback. This is the AIP client, pretty much the visibility side of the AIP client, showing right here. So this is where I could select one of my labels. I could edit it, change it to confidential, change it back to internal. But notice here that when I opened up Word, let me open up another one, not save this. Just going to open up Word. Whoops, here we go. You'll notice that I am being assigned a label automatically. Internal is by default selected. That's driven by my policy. So if I wanted to make sure every document is labeled across the entire organization, one of the steps is making sure every document that a user accesses gets labeled. And we define that as a default label within the label policy. Doesn't mean that I can't change it as a user because my label configuration lets me do that. But this may or may not be something that you want to do. The reason that I have it set up here is it helps with my initial discovery. So This is the end user experience when you're using the client. If you don't have the client, you still have this sensitivity bar, and you'll have your labels shown in the sensitivity bar, or the sensitivity button, where you could still see all the labels assigned to you. But as I just said, I have labels being assigned by default, so I can do some tracking and reporting, and that goes back to our discovery. So now let me jump back to the scanner and recall that I said the scanner configuration is driven by the scan job configuration. And that scan job configuration really is dependent on the labeling policy. So there's a lot of different layers here, and it can get very complex and very confusing. But my discovery job here that I've created in Azure, I'm pretty much saying, hey, I'm going to run this manually. There's an option for recommended labeling. I've got that turned off, but in our policy, if we were doing that sensitive information detection, we could say, well, don't enforce that, but recommend it. We could, from the scanner, say, hey, go ahead and apply it, even if the policy says just recommend it. That's really what that means. The enforce is pretty much saying, hey, turn this scan job on, do something. If I don't say enforce, it's not going to label anything. Label files based on content, I'm turning that on because I have that confidential label that looks for those sensitive information types. But default label, use my policy definition. But one thing you'll see here is, or you won't see here, is what policy am I assigning to this scan job? You don't see any blade here or any pop out to say, hey, select this label and policy. If I look back here to my label policies, I've got a policy called default corp data protection policy, but there's nowhere here in my scan job that I can define that. The reason is because that's driven by the service account running on the scanner itself. So when I deployed my scanner onto my my server here, I'm using a specific service account. And I can see what that account is pretty much only by looking at the services here. Because I've installed the scanner, there is an Azure Information Protection Scanner service. And in here, you'll see I'm using my domain account for AIP scan SVC. That is my service account. If I look back at my labeling policy, that's that service account right here. So by assigning that service account to my labeling policy, that's how my content scan job is going to apply that policy to the data that it discovers. So it seems very complex and inefficient to have the configurations jump through so many hoops. But the reason for that is because this can be very flexible. If I have 50 or 100 different scanner instances, they could all run with different service accounts. And based on those service accounts, they might get different policies, labeling policies. So I could technically create one scan job and apply it to all of my different scanners. The policy, the labeling policy, is actually going to define what the default label is, if there is one, and what kind of labels to apply if there's sensitive information discovered. Maybe there's no labels being applied, but that's going to be driven by the policy. But it makes my scan job a little bit simpler because I don't have to know all the policies, but I can say, hey, override the policy with some of these settings here, or just use what the policy has configured, like here, policy default. I could say my scan job, I don't want to apply a default label, or maybe I want to define a default label, and here's my labels available to me from my unified store. But I'm just going to say use what's ever defined in the policy. What does the scan job look at though? So again, the on-premise scanner instance is deployed, but what am I scanning? It's just an agent that's sitting on that server, but we haven't told it, what am I looking at? What SharePoint on-premise sites am I looking at? What on-premise SMB file shares am I looking at? Well, that's in the repository configuration. And you can see here, I've added two repositories. They are SMB file shares, just shared folders on one of my servers. But if I wanted to add a SharePoint site, I could do that. I just type in the URL of my on-premise SharePoint site. Now this is relative to my on-premise network. So let's say my internal DNS namespace is a .local. Well, that's the namespace I would use here. It would be, SharePoint farm1.domain.local. because this config is being pushed down to the scanner instances. And if that's how I'm resolving my on-premise SharePoint site, that's how the scanner needs to see this repository configuration. You can see here that as I define a repository, the locations of my data, I also have the ability to get granular and say, hey, do I want to listen to my policy or my scan job itself? Or do I want to override that and do different things based on the repository? This can get very complex if you're going to start saying, hey, I'm going to treat each repository differently. So the recommendation is definitely try to keep it all contained in either the scan job or at the label and policy level. Because if you start mixing and matching, you could have 3 different locations to try to troubleshoot and identify why isn't my label being applied correctly by the scanner. Is it at the repository? Is it at the content scan job? Is it at the label policy? Requires a lot of digging to identify what the root cause would be. So after you define your scan job, you kick it off from Azure itself. Right now, I'm not sure why it's telling me it's not available, but if I wanted to start the scan job, I would check the box and I should have the scan now option. That would tell the scanner to go ahead and start doing its thing. Start looking at the repositories that's configured in the scan job and start applying the policy label policy that is assigned to the service account in which the scanner is installed. How do you know this has done anything? Well, there's 2 ways. If you look at the scanner itself, there is a report that does get generated. Now, it's not easy to find, but it's actually in the service accounts local app data folder. I'm not logged in as this AIP scan service, but that's what the scanner runs under. So I need to look in the profile of that scan service. And in here, we have this Microsoft Information Protection, and we have pretty much some details around the scanner config itself. But of course, I'm going to forget where the reports are located. So in the logs, scanner log will contain everything that is being done by the scanner. If I open this up in Notepad, you'll see a lot of details here that tell you what's going on. I've actually got a lot of warnings. Oh, well, maybe that's why it's not actually working. I guess I should have checked this before. The scanner has to authenticate to Azure. So there's a commandlet that we run that says, go get a token from Azure AIP or from Azure AD, essentially. Apparently I've got an issue there, so that might be why I don't have a report being generated here. Well, that stinks. I thought I was going to be able to show you that. Anyways, the report, I should have a copy of it. Sorry, give me 1 second. And I apparently got rid of that as well. All right. Well, there's a CSV file that will be generated that lists every file that it found in the scan job, and then it will identify to you what label would I have applied. Even if we're not enforcing the labeling, we're doing a report only mode. So part of our discovery, hey, find out what we have. Run the scanner in a report only mode. It's going to generate a list of all of our data, all the files. And if it detected any kind of sensitive information in there, what label would I apply to that file if I was applying labels? Once you go through all of that and review those report files, then you can say, you know what, let's start labeling data and applying protections. Another way is to use AIP Analytics. Now, this does require you to have a log analytics workspace configured, so there's some cost associated to this. But if you have this configured, this should show me data from when it was working at one time. So if I look at the data discovery, you'll see that I have my 2 file repositories that I defined in my content scan job. If I click in here, you'll see the individual files that were discovered. Maybe if it loads. Okay, here we go. So here's all of the files that were discovered in those repositories. So I can see the full path here to the file name, but also what was discovered. This apparently had a Slovenia tax identification number in it. That is a known sensitive information type, not one that I'm using as far as one of my labels, But the scanner is going to identify all the different sensitive information types that are out there. So here's an EU phone number, EU GPS coordinates. So nothing with US tax information or HIPAA information or anything like that. But this does give me a good picture of what is out there in my environment. So if I wanted to, I can drill into the data and get a little more detail. But because this is a log analytics workspace underneath the hood, I could actually run queries against log analytics to build my own reports if I wanted to. This is the query that built that pane, that dashboard that we just saw here. I could dive deep into the data if I wanted to see what's really going on. So what is beneficial here is this analytics is going to give me the ability to do a quick view of, okay, what do I have in my environment? I could use this data discovery to find out what kind of sensitive information types do I have. I could use the log analytics query to look at all the data and say, okay, query on this attribute of the log information type matches and look for credit card numbers. And that's going to show me all of the files across my environment that I've scanned that contain credit card numbers. So now I can kind of make some decisions on what kind of protections I want to put into place. So that does require a log analytics workspace, as I said, does require some cost to it because there's data ingestion. But one thing you'll see here too is I have an endpoint list in here, and that is the name of my client workstation. When you install the unified labeling client or the AIP client onto the workstations, that also reports back to AIP Analytics. So now I can see the files that are discovered or the activity that's being performed on that individual endpoint. That doesn't mean that it's enrolled with Intune. It doesn't mean that it's being managed. It doesn't even mean that something like Defender for Endpoint is enabled or onboarded with that machine. This is just the AIP client looking at what's happening within Office. And you can see here, I've got some sample docs here that have been labeled internal. That's my default label, but here's a couple that have my confidential label applied. And maybe those were manually assigned, and maybe that was automatically detected because it contained something sensitive in that document. I can drill down through analytics to get that detail. So once you have Scanner set up, and I know I'm running out of time here, but once you have Scanner set up, once you've done the discovery, once you have a unified labeling policy or an auto labeling policy defined to scan your online data, this is what's going to give you that visibility into what you have. Now you need to make decisions with that data. You could apply labels that apply restrictions, encryption, require certain permissions. So you have to be a member of a certain group. You have to be a member of the tenant. You have to be able to authenticate. We can apply some pretty granular permissions. Do you want to do that across the board for every file in your organization? That's a decision point that you'll have to come to because most likely the answer is no. But maybe you do. Maybe you do want to make sure that every document that is created within your organization at least has some default permissions assigned to prevent that data from leaving the organization and being consumed outside of the organization by either a competitor or just someone randomly who happens to get access to that document of a flash drive or in an email or whatnot. So that's a decision point based on what you discover that's in your data. What kind of risk do you have with the sensitive information that you have in your environment? Based on that, you can start defining what your labels look like. And I know I have just a very basic structure here, public, internal, confidential. There is an order to these labels. Order matters when it comes to your labels. The label with the highest order will always supersede lower order labels. So let's say I'm doing auto labeling because my confidential label is looking for sensitive information, right? My label here is going to detect when a credit card number is used. But what if my internal label was doing the exact same thing? So technically, both of those labels would apply because a credit card number is detected within a document. That's where order comes into play. It will always assign the label with the highest order. So instead of internal, I will get that document assigned the confidential label because it looks at credit card numbers as well. I know with less than 10 minutes, I don't want to dive too much deeper. I could probably talk for another hour on data protection. But when you start looking at the big picture, right? So let's assume the normal situation where you're not going to label every document. You do want to discover what you have. So you are going to deploy your scanner. You are going to deploy an auto labeling policy for a simulation mode to see what you have in your environment. But most likely, I'm not going to say this is going to be the case, but most likely you're going to assign labels to sensitive information only, which means 90% roughly of your data is not going to be touched, not going to be labeled. That still doesn't mean you don't want to control how that data is being shared, where it's going. That's where we need to layer on our data loss prevention policies. That's where we need to layer on some of the other tools that we have available to us within the Microsoft 365 platform that provides us some control and visibility in where data is being communicated. So the data loss prevention policies, those also can be configured here in the protection portal. This is moving to the compliance portal. So in here, I can create a policy to look and see when data is being shared externally. But you can see up here is going to be moving over to the compliance portal eventually. So this might disappear from this portal. I could create a DLP policy that detects my labels, right? So maybe there's a situation to where you have a vendor or a partner that you do have to share information with that has credit card information in it, right? Maybe that document is auto labeled with our confidential label, but maybe the permissions in that label will let everyone from our partner's domain authenticate to that document as well. Just because we have the label allowing people in our partner organization to authenticate to the document, we probably still want to know, when is that document being shared, communicated? How is it being communicated? Is it a SharePoint link? Is it being attached as an email? Is it being sent as a Teams message? That's where DLP is going to come into play. And then we can either monitor, we can prevent that communication, or we can moderate it, saying that someone has to approve it before it actually gets communicated out. Another component that we can add in here is integration with Cloud App Security, as well as Defender for Endpoint. Now, you saw in here on my analytics that this is all endpoint detections because it's the AIP client doing things on that endpoint. That's not enrolled with Defender or onboarded to Defender, but the AIP client is telling me, hey, something's going on in this machine in regards to data protection. I could integrate Defender for Endpoint. And what Defender for Endpoint integration with AIP does is it will start looking at content on the machine itself. So if I wanted to see data that is being opened, but maybe I don't have the AIP client deployed on that endpoint, Defender for Endpoint will tell me that because it's tracking that activity. It will log it in Defender for Endpoint, and then Defender for Endpoint will kind of pour over those logs to AIP, and AIP will look at the logs and say, hey, yeah, that document has this metadata that indicates this label is applied. I'm going to create an event for that. The other part is Cloud App Security. Now, Cloud App Security is going to be more of an impact when you start talking about the data loss prevention side, because we can do a lot in Cloud App Security on file policies to say, hey, if a file contains sensitive information, go ahead and apply a label to it. But our default labeling policy, or our user labeling policy, might be doing that for us anyways. But where MCAS has value is, let's say you're using a third-party service, Workday, Dropbox, ServiceNow. We can extend our AIP and data protection capabilities now into those third-party services, because MCAS has API integration with those third-party services to scan all of the content within those locations and apply labels as necessary. So, as you start developing your bigger picture data protection strategy, it's not just going to be AIP or unified labeling. It's going to be probably multiple different pieces of the Microsoft 365 platform. So that, let me jump back here real quick. That kind of goes back to this picture here. Whoops, now it's going forward. Come on. Now it's all over the place. All right, that's awesome. Here we go. All right, I don't know why it's auto clicking through everything. All right, so when we look at the big picture, Microsoft Information Protection, we talked about AIP, we talked about the unified labeling, but when you hear the reference to Microsoft Information Protection, it's the collection. It's not a product. MIP or MIP is not a product. It's not a replacement for AIP. It's not a replacement for unified labeling. It is the collection of Microsoft services that gives you that big picture data protection strategy. So as I mentioned, you might have strong labeling in place, but it's going to be data loss prevention on top of that. It's going to be MCAS on top of that. That gives you that big end state, that complete protection strategy. And I don't know why my screen is jumping all over the place, but we are at time, so let me wrap up here. That did wrap up our series. You can see here on the links, you can go back and review and watch some of the recordings. We will have this recording up here in the next day or so, but I appreciate everyone's time to participate in these webinar sessions. Hopefully throughout the series, you've gotten some value and some benefit out of these. If you do want to learn more about any of these topics, don't hesitate to reach out. We will be putting together our 2021 webinar series here shortly, so look for an announcement on what that series topic will be, as well as the schedule for the individual sessions. But with that, I'll open it up for any questions if anyone has any questions. I know I've been talking nonstop here for the last hour, but feel free to ask any questions or any comments. I will be sending out a feedback survey, so please take a minute to provide feedback, and thanks again for attending.